everybody. You're listening to Vin Russo at Herp Hooray with Jason Rossi. Stay tuned for more great stuff.
It says here we should work in teams. I tend to think of myself as a one-man wolf pack.
You're about to enter information overload, a worldwide transmission with Herp Hooray featured Breeder of the Week. Here's your host, Jason Rossi.
Hey guys, welcome back to Herp Hooray, your weekly dose of reptile breeding care and special tips and tricks. This week, I would like to announce we are having a Herp Hooray pastel ball python giveaway, so please go over to herphooray.com and check out the details. Okay. This week's featured breeder of the week has written a couple books that I personally own one of them. He specializes in boa constrictors, ball pythons, green trees, and hognose. Vin Russo from Cutting Edge Herp. Vincent Russo from CuttingEdgeHerp.com is this week's special guest. Vin, welcome to Herp Hooray.
Thanks for having me.
We appreciate you taking time out, man, and coming on our show, man. We definitely appreciate you.
Thanks.
So why don't you tell our listeners how you got your start in breeding snakes?
Well, I started breeding snakes when I was a child. Was always enamored by reptiles and dinosaurs, just like everybody else out there who's into this stuff now. And as a kid, got my first corn snakes, king snakes, at a local pet shop, found snakes out in the wild. I grew up in New York State, and I'd go camping every summer, so I'd find milk snakes and garter snakes and DK snakes, and just got hooked on it, and, figured out that, it'd be nice to breed these and make some babies and see what they look like. So at a young age, I started breeding colubrids, which were pretty hot back in the 80s. I mean, there weren't a lot of people breeding snakes back then, and there wasn't much information about it, and joined the Herp Society, and it all snowballed from there.
Awesome, man. Well, we grew up in upstate New York here, too, and it's definitely got some nice reptiles out there if you can catch them.
Sure.
So why don't you give us a rundown of how you start your breeding for your boa constrictors?
Well, the boas they're a little different than most reptiles in that they require some more care and manipulation and temperature manipulation. So as far as getting started, all the boas that I breed in my facility, I raise up from babies in the building, and they all get temperature cycled with the rest of the snakes. So even the young ones get exposed to a cooler winter night and less food in the winter. As far as getting the adults prepared for breeding, I have non-feeding and feeding seasons in my building, and when it's a feeding season, I feed them a lot. When it's non-feeding, I don't feed them almost at all. So this time of year, snakes are together breeding. It's obviously a non-feeding season, but it's a breeding season. So and as far as feeding, I do most of my feeding in the late summer and early fall. And, as soon as they look fat and happy and healthy enough, I start turning the heat off at night and start introducing males with females.
So if I remember correctly in this book, it's been a while since I read it, boas in captivity, but you try to mimic the wild to the best of your ability to try to, give them that environment.
Yeah, I definitely do. I've traveled to South America and Central America a few times and went there in different seasons just to see what it was like. And what I did notice, especially in South America, is during the dry season, it's cooler and drier. a lot of people think, oh, it's a dry season, it doesn't rain. It still rains in the dry season, but in the rainy season, it rains every day. In the dry season, it's cooler, drier, and there's not as much food around. And obviously, since the snakes are cooler, it gets cooler at night. They don't have the ability to eat large meals and digest them, so they simply don't. Plus, they don't have the heat capacity to have enough energy to catch large meals. Plus, there's not a lot of food around. And then I noticed during the rainy season, when the rains do come and the floodwaters come in, there's an abundance of life. The birds are reproducing, the rodents are reproducing because there's more food, there's more heat, and from there the snakes start gorging themselves. A similar scenario in North America would be like how colubrids come out of hibernation and gorge themselves on food, like garter snakes and hognose snakes. They'll sit around a pond where there's frogs and toads and just gorge themselves and eat all day. Because their window of opportunity to eat is so short. It could be 8 weeks in the north. Boa constrictors down in South America have a few months to do that. So, but they really don't eat a lot during the dry season. They're just kind of estivating and waiting. Even though it is warm at points, they just sit and wait for the next season to come by, and that's what I try to create in captivity.
That's awesome,
Not as
man.
Extreme, though.
Say again?
Not as extreme. I mean, in the wild, they may have a dry season that extends much longer than they want. So I just try to create a seasonality, and that basically is the answer to breeding most things. I mean, even people that breed tropical fish create a seasonality too.
Well, I got to tell you, our first year as breeders, we successfully produced a litter of boas and some balls with the help of your book. So we definitely appreciate that knowledge that you put out there for us to, dive into and absorb.
Thanks. I've had a few people come up to me and say that to me. That makes me proud.
All right. Well, I was checking out your website last night, and I saw this thing, the red dragon, and I was like, wow, it looks like a blood albino or something like that, So I was reading in your thing, and then that's exactly what it was, man. That's an amazing animal.
Yeah, I produced that 2 years ago from double hets that I had produced 8 years ago, I guess. Maybe a little longer, I forget. I think I put the story on my website. But, yeah, that was a long-term project. I bred a blood boa or an albino. I think it was back in 2005 or 6, I forget. Raised up the double hats and bred them to each other in 2011 and produced, was that 2010? I seem to lose time lately. But anyway, the chances of producing the red dragon were 1 in 16, and I had made one in a nice sized litter. So yeah, that is a really cool looking snake. It's pretty much stayed that way. It's a nice burnt orange red snake. I'm hoping that it might breed this year. It's a male, so it might go. Who knows?
Now, are the bloods, are they Central Americans?
Yeah, the bloods are Central Americans. I've had people say, "Oh, you're mixing and matching," but it was going to be inevitable eventually that people will be mixing some morphs into the blood. So I still have bloods that are pure Central American that I breed to and keep them pure. I had a blood male that it was questionable what he was and where he came from, so I just used him in the albino project. So I also have some bloods that are hypo, but I used an orange tail hypo in those, so they're pure Central American too. But it's a morph, so eventually everybody's going to be mixing and matching stuff into them. It's kind of inevitable in a way.
And the Central Americans, they tend to stay on the smaller side, correct?
They definitely do. They definitely stay a little smaller. But, then again, I've got Colombian boas that are pretty small, too. They're maybe 5 or 6 feet also. So, It depends on the locality and where they're from, but most Central American boas are pretty small. Although I have seen larger ones in the past, but those are always the exception and not the rule. So, but yeah, your average size Central American boas are like 5 feet. That's pretty much, that's a small snake. It's amazing how everybody, you talk about boas to people and they're like, oh, boa constrictors, don't they get giant and eat people? I'm like, no, nobody's ever been hurt or injured by a boa constrictor in history. And, a giant boa constrictor is like 8 or 9 feet. That's a real big one. I think I've seen a single boa in my whole life that was over 10 feet, and that's only one. That's like finding a 20-foot reticulated python, or maybe something bigger than that. But as far as boa constrictors getting giant, they're all pretty small comparing them to giant pythons.
Now that big one that was in captivity?
Which one?
The
largest boa I ever saw. Yeah, that was in captivity. It was at Tom Crutchfield's place. It was a large Suriname boa. Saw it there about 15, maybe more than 15 years ago. And it was just this giant, immense boa. It was huge. I couldn't believe the size of this thing. And it came out of the wild. It wasn't a captive raised snake. It came out of the wild that large. So, I mean, again, that's like finding the Holy Grail. That's a giant snake that could be 50 years old.
You don't think by feeding that you could obtain the same thing? You think it's the genetics?
I think it's genetics, number one, and I don't think by feeding you can do that, and I'll tell you why. By feeding, you can make a snake very fat and obese and look really large, but it'll be very unhealthy for the snake, and as far as length of time that it'll live, it'll shorten it. I think in the wild, when a snake is exposed to, again, these seasonalities and dry seasons and rainy seasons and times of not feeding for months and months and months and then eating, a few large meals a year, I think that's how a snake becomes a giant. And I think it's also the trick, people are talking about 30-foot reticulated pythons. I think one was found in history on the island of Sulawesi many years ago, and they haven't found another one since as far as something being 30 feet. But I think if you're going to do it in captivity, you're not going to do it by feeding it, a rabbit every week. You're going to do it by feeding a pig every, 2 or 3 months, and then let it sit for a while and just absorb all that nutrients and absorb, obtain muscle mass to make itself last the time. Eugene Bissett used to say stuff to me like snakes grow more when you don't feed them, and he was 100% right, because they store energy when you don't feed them. When you feed them a lot, it's just like they eat something and they use it up and they pass most of it right through instead of absorbing a lot of it. So if you're feeding a snake a lot, they're just getting fat. They're not getting muscle mass and weight to them. So, and I think that's the secret to making a really big python. In the case of boas, I think it's worthless to make one giant. It would just take too long, and it doesn't matter. So,
if they're eating a lot, they're wasting a lot.
Yeah, they're wasting a lot of the food. They're just pooping it right through. I see people all the time. They'll show me pictures. They'll say, "Vin, I bought this snake from you last year, and it's 6 feet long already, and it eats 2 or 3 jumbo rats at a time, and it'll be this big fat sausage thing." And I'll say to them, "Slow down, man. You're gonna kill that thing." And sure enough, 2 years later, that snake died. I don't know why. I don't know what happened. So if you want longevity, you just don't feed them out. I've got snakes in my collection that I've had for 20 years, boa constrictors. I've got ball pythons I've had for longer than that.
Yeah, I've heard up to 40 years for ball pythons. I wasn't too sure on the boas, but 20, that's a long time. Yeah, 20. I've got a boa that's over 20 years in my care. And I know, I think it was Roger Conant, who's written many books on snakes and was also the curator of the Philadelphia Zoo. He had a ball python for 50 years, and I think the ball python's still there. And Roger Conant passed away, so somebody out there might know. another heirloom pet.
Yeah, that snake I think holds the record for longest in captivity, longest length of time in captivity.
So what is your favorite locale to work with in boas?
My favorite are the Longicarda, simply because I was around when they were being described by Dr. Price and my brother and Sam McDowell, who's a taxonomist, was looking at them. I saw them, the first shipment of them come in back in 1989, I think it was. So, and they're just very variable and just a cool snake. Out of all the snakes in my collection, those are the ones I really like the most. They're all black. Some of them are all black. Some of them are yellow and black. Some of them are black and white. They're just really cool snakes. And when they first came in, none of them that came out of the wild looked like the ones I have today, which is interesting. Most of them were jet black that came out of the wild. I think one of them was like that yellowish or even a brownish color in black. But I just really like them a lot. And a close second are the Pearl Island boas. I think they're the coolest things.
Yeah, I like how light they are. They're pretty cool. So what is on the cover of the boas in captivity? A hippo Nick? Is that what that is?
That's a hippo Nicaraguan boa, and a lot of people thought that was like a Photoshop photo, but that snake really is that red. I still have that snake to this day. It's a little darker now because it's an older snake. But I have its progeny, and they're very similar to it too. They don't look like that when they're born. Because the color red takes a while to manifest itself in boa constrictors. Just like blood boas, they're born like a reddish maroon color, but as they get older, by the time they're like a year or two, they get that nice deep red color. Same with Colombian boas. If you got Colombian boas that have nice red on the sides, they'll show up as maybe a pinkish as a hatchling, but by the time they're 2 years old, they get that nice deep red on their sides, and the tail gets a deeper red color. It's the same with the Nicks. They're born a little drab, like an orangey color and pink, and by the time they're like 2 years old, they really start to color up nice. But then when they get a little older, like 5 or 6 years old, they get darker, like a lot of Central American boas do. That picture is a pretty accurate, depiction of what those snakes look like.
Why do you think that is? Over age, they tend to darken.
I really don't know why. A lot of snakes darken. Even I've got Peru boas that the older they get, the darker they get also. So it could be age. It could be just an evolutionary ability to absorb more sun. Cause I really don't know. I don't know.
All right. Well, we're going to switch it over to your other project you got there, the Het Russo, the White Diamond. So why don't you tell our listeners how you came across that in your collection?
Well, the first Het was a snake that I bought as a bush baby back in 1995 or 6. And believe it or not, I got it from Kevin McCurley. He was selling a bunch of bush babies at a show here in New York. And just went to his table, and because I was friends with him, still am, and talking ball pythons, which a lot of people weren't into ball pythons too much back then. And I had a whole bunch of them at the time, and he and I were the type of guys that would go to a show and look around for oddball looking things, and we'd compare notes with each other sometimes and say, "What do you think of this thing? You think it's going to do anything?" And here he was at his table, had a Rubbermaid bin full of bush babies. Bush babies are balls that are like yearling size that came out of Africa, and I think they were $50 each or something like that. And one was a really, really yellow snake. And I'm like, I'll take that one. I didn't even tell him why. I just thought it was cool. And it was a female, so I started the long way with that project. Now, keep in mind, I didn't even know this was a Het for anything. I just thought it was a really nice yellow, more yellow than normal ball python. And I raised it up, and first year I bred it to a normal, and the only normal I had was a Het albino male. And that was in 99, I think, was the first year I bred that snake, or 98. and she laid 5 or 6 eggs, and half of them came out to look just like her, and held them back. I remember telling Greg Graziani about it and saying, because at the same time he was making pastels, and I said, I think I got a type of pastel. It's not as orange as yours. There's more of a yellow snake. Sent him some pictures, and we compared notes too, and I think a year or two later he made a super pastel, and I was thinking, wow, I can make a super yellow thing. I called them lemon balls at the time. And I had bred a male back to the mother and a sister in 2001, and the mother laid 6 or 7 eggs, and they all hatched, and I got similar results. Half the babies looked like the parents, but some were normal. And I'm like, wow, I guess there is no super form, or maybe I missed. And then the second clutch hatch, which was to the sibling, and there was only 2 eggs in the clutch, and one of them hatched to be the leucistic. So that was the first leucistic. That was the first leucistic born in captivity, blue-eyed leucistic at least. And the same year, a guy in England produced the super fires. I don't even remember his name. But anyway, he had sent me. Yeah, that was it. He had sent me pictures of his leucistic and some of the hets, and he and I were comparing notes, saying that these lighter snakes are obviously the hets, and they're an incomplete dominant, and the super form is these white snakes. So I guess I was really lucky. I definitely was really lucky, because that was a turning point in my career to decide whether or not I was going to do snakes full time. Because back then I was a mortgage banker, and as soon as that happened, I took the snake business to the next level and got out of the banking, which luckily I did, because that was collapsing at that time.
The banking bubble.
Yeah, the banking business. That was 2001. So
the housing.
Yep, a lot of people don't realize even in 2001 we were feeling it, but the general public didn't see it yet.
No, they're feeling it now, I think. But that Mystic goes really well with that white diamond, I gotta say. Does that hold that yellow as it grows?
The Invisible, you mean that thing? The Mystic, the Mystic White Diamond cross?
Yes.
Yeah, I call it an Invisible, simply because it looks like it's invisible. Yeah. Yeah, it definitely held that yellow, and the sides got even more purple, which is really neat. I really like that snake. There's just something cool about it. I was hoping not to make another pure white snake from that cross, and luckily I didn't. So I got something pretty cool out of that. I know some other guys have done the Phantom to my Russo and have had similar product made, and one of them is called an opal diamond, I think they call it, which is similar to this Invisible. I haven't seen the opal diamond as it's grown yet, but the Invisible looks very similar to those, and it is different though. You can see that there's a difference in it.
I gotta tell you, man, that thing is outstanding. But there's another one there too, the paradox animal with the black eye and the red pupil, the pinto pied. Do they all paradox up like that?
Yeah, the pinto pied is very predictable. They all come out exactly like that, and all it is a pied that is het leucistic, and they come out as a pure white pied with a partially patterned nose. Their heads are white, and they all have one blotch of orange with 2 black dashes in it on their neck. Every one of them that I've made so far. So that thing is pretty cool too. I know Ralph Davis made pieds het, or I should say pied lessers, and they came out to be all white with black eyes. So in reality, they were just a really nice looking leucistic, which is really neat. And I know I think Steve Russo made the White Wedding, which is a similar. I think it's a pied spider that's all white also. But I like how with my trait, the Russo trait, it's like an eraser, but it only partially erases. It's not strong enough to completely erase like the lessers do on some things. And I'm not knocking the lessers. I think that's the coolest morph also because it does other things, especially kingpins and all that cool stuff. But I just like how on that pinto pied, it looks like it's been partially erased, and you kind of hit the nail on the head by calling it a paradox. But in reality, it's not. It just looks like one.
Well, man, if you got an animal that's producing things like that, it's definitely going to be a hot commodity in the future for things to come for ball pythons. Putting a pattern on an all-white snake, that's what we've been trying to do.
In the beginning, a lot of people are saying, leucistic is a dead end. All you can make is leucistics, but it's not true. With these hets, you can, anything that's het leucistic is definitely different because the het part, like I said, it erases some of the traits. I've made champagnes Het Russo that look really cool. I've even made cinnamon Het Russos, spider Het Russos, which my friend Frake in Holland calls, he's got a name for them. I'll have to think about it. I don't know why I don't have it on the top of my head. He calls them something bees. I'll remember it. But anyway, I even made a pinstripe Het leucistic this year. Everything I make with it comes out pretty cool, so I can't complain.
Was that the picture of the two pinstripes together and one's noticeably lighter?
No, that's on my website. That's a Congo pinstripe, the Congo ball. A lot of people ask me about that. I haven't finished the Congo page on my website yet. The Congo ball is a whole nother thing that started way back in the early 90s, too. Just a wild-caught snake that was really cool patterned and had a nice orange gold glow to it, and that turned out to be dominant. There's no super form, but everything I make with it, pastels, pinstripes, everything I've made into the Congo is really cool looking. I've even made ghost Congos, ghost Congo pastels. My good friend Eugene Bissett ended up getting a bunch of Congo stuff from me back in 2003, and he's been making all kinds of funky stuff with it. And last year he sent me pictures of all these funky ghosts, and I'm like, I've never made a ghost from mine. And I'm thinking it was something he made, and he said, Vin, no, these are from siblings to siblings. There's nothing mixed in them. So this past season I made some ghosts too. And only because I bred siblings to each other because I've been just outcrossing these things. And this year was the first year I bred siblings and made some cool ghost things with them. So, there's a 1,000,001 combinations now out there, and I don't think we'll ever see the end. I mean, it's just endless now with what can be done with ball pythons.
And that's what's so great about it. I mean, no limit to what you can do is just kind of a daunting task.
Yeah, it is. And it gets to the point where it's like it's good and it's bad. It's bad because if you're new and you just get into ball pythons today and you go online and you take a look at how many there are out there, it would take you months or weeks to really get a handle on what makes what,
We're going to need our own college course.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I feel bad for somebody who just gets in. To this day, I still have people ask me, Vin, how do you, what two things make this or what two things make that? And I have it on the top of my mind because I'm in it and I do it every day. But for somebody who's just getting in or somebody who's even been in for a year or two, it's a struggle. I mean, it's a lot to hold on to and remember. I mean, every year somebody's coming up with a new book on ball python morphs. That's never going to end,
I remember it was like 5 years ago when we started, and didn't seem like there was that. I mean, there was a lot, but it just saw it grow every year, just 5 genes. We don't know how many genes. It's just like amazing. I'm glad to be a part of it.
I remember Greg Graziani about 10 years ago saying to me, Vin, there's 50 traits out there. Can you believe 50? And now there's a lot more than that.
That's what everybody has in their collection.
Yeah.
So the red-eye animal beneath that, is that the Russo albino? It's got some striping going on.
Yeah, that's the Russo leucistic albino. I call that the polar ball. It's an all-white ball python, pure white leucistic, but it's got red eyes because it's albino. So I've only made one of those so far, and that was a total mistake. Simply because I think I told you a couple minutes ago, the very first time I bred a snake to my very first het leucistic, I used the het albino male. So the het albino gene is floating around in my collection, and it's popped up this one time. At least I know which male and which female are hets, meaning het albino, and I've bred them the last 2 years straight, and I haven't hit the polar ball yet because that's a 1 in 8 from doing het to het, because I have a het albino. I mean, I have a double het albino leucistic male. At least one I know is a definite het, and I have at least one female double het albino leucistic female. So that pair I put together, and I just got lucky the first time, and the first polar ball I made was a female, so she's just almost big enough to breed now. So it's a long project, but if I use the polar ball female back to a double het male, then 1 in 4 will be a polar ball or an albino leucistic.
Like, what are the chances of those two genes lining up and that awesome animal just come out of the egg? What were you thinking when you saw it? When it first hatched, it pulled its head in the egg, and I just saw the nose sticking out, and I'm like, oh wow, that's a really pink-looking leucistic, And then the next day its head was out with the red eyes. I was like, oh wow, I guess I did hit it eventually. I knew the gene was there. I just didn't know who was going to make them. So it was a waiting game.
It turned out the very first leucistic male I made was a het albino because it was his son and daughter that turned out to be hets also.
All right. Well, Jay from Cartel Reptiles on the H3 boards wants to know, what's your next move with the Het Russos?
My next move? Well, I'm mixing them into a bunch of stuff now this year just to see what I'm going to get. I'm doing more with the Mystic. I'm trying to make some more stuff with the Mystic with my Russo, with a couple other traits to see what that does to them. Last year I did that Champagne Russo. This year I'm seeing what a Lemon Blast Russo is going to look like, and a Bumblebee Russo is going to look like, stuff like that, simple stuff, general stuff that a lot of people have. And I'm mixing it into, I'm going to mix it into the Fireball and see what that looks like. I'm sure there'll be a really light-colored snake. I'm doing it into the Enchi, which I think that's going to be pretty cool, an Enchi Het Russo. I saw one that a guy made last year. It was pretty cool looking, really yellow. Anything to add into Enchi is nice. So, again, we're at the point now where it's limitless. I mean, I can keep going and going and going. I like what Mike Wilbanks has made with he calls the nuclear stuff, in which he used a butter, fire, and a pin, and a butter, fire, and a spider. He calls them nuclear. And I'm gonna try a similar thing with the Russo, fire and a pin, and see what that looks like. Hopefully, it'll look similar to that nuclear thing that Mike made.
Yeah, those are some awesome animals as well. Can't wait to get him on the show. But why don't you give us a rundown on the caramels and ultramels and the camarillos?
Yeah, it's a hot topic considering a lot of people. There's a lot of confusion, I should say, it all stems back. Kevin McCurley started out with what he called a caramel albino. And also a guy named Ernie Wagner was producing snakes from a wild-caught snake that he called caramels too. And what had happened was, I know Mark Bell ended up with some caramels from Ernie Wagner, and he also ended up with caramels from Kevin. And from what I gathered, he had bred a caramel male that he had gotten from Kevin to a few het caramel females that were from his Ernie Wagner line. And when he bred them to each other, he didn't make any caramels. So he was a little pissed off, number one. Number two, he just, was like, wow, I guess these aren't compatible. And that's when I had gotten a couple males from those breedings. And it was sold to me just as het caramels. And I bred one male to some normal females and made normal babies that were all possible het for caramel. And those females I held back. I think I made about 5 of them the first year. That was 2001. And held them back, and by 2004, bred them back to the double het male. I should say the het caramel male. I didn't know he was a double het at the time. And out of the 5 females, 4 of them proved out to be het for caramel, or caramel and ultramel, or both. And back then, nobody really used the name ultramel yet. So I didn't even know what they were. The first thing I made out of those breedings was an ultra, and showed it to Kevin McCurley. I'm like, this is the coolest caramel I ever saw. He's like, that's not a caramel. What is it? He's like, I don't know. And then I made a caramel that year, and then I made the double homozygous, which is what I called the camarillo. I didn't start calling it a camarillo until years later. So the first year, right out of the gate, I made the camarillo, the caramel, and the ultramel, all from 3 different females, and just assumed that something was going on, and then got the story that, there was 2 lines of caramel, and just figured it out that, I had both traits in the one snake. So the ultramels are not compatible with caramels, obviously. But the double homozygous is a really cool-looking snake, the camarillo. I mean, they start out looking like a lemon yellow with some lavender coloring to them, and they stay that way. I mean, they look the only thing I can compare them to is a banana. They look just like a banana, but the difference is bananas, as they get older, kind of fade. This snake, as it gets older, stays the same. And the ultras, they really are really vibrant as adults. They really stay that nice bright orange color too. So that's just a cool project. I really like it, and I've held on to a bunch of stuff from those. And I make a bunch of them a year, and not the camarillos, but the ultras and the caramels I make. The camarillos, again, are like a 1 in 8 shot in the breedings I've been doing. So if I hit them, great. If I don't, no big deal. But so far I've kept whatever I've made as far as camarillos out of that project. And, I think once we mix them into stuff like pieds and pastels and pinstripes, and then you're going to really see some cool stuff too. So
don't forget the white diamond now.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what an ultra white diamond will look like? I mean, boy, who knows what a white diamond ultra will look like? It could completely skew the white diamond. Who knows? Nobody knows.
I'm sure we'll see one day, you and I.
Yeah, one day soon.
So do you got any leopards running around your collection in your pipes?
I've got something else running around in there. I had sent some snakes to my good friend Frake, who's in Holland, and a couple of years ago I sent him some pastels, het pied, and they were from a pastel bred to an original het pied female. And they were cool-looking pastels, and he bred them into het pied females he had gotten from me. So he bred the pastel het pied to normal het pied females, all that came from me. and he produced what he calls stripopides, which are just a really cool-looking striped pied, but that are also pastel. But he's also made normals, and I've made some normals now too, that are similar to these leopard balls. But he's calling them. He had another name for them. Let me look at it real quick. I think he called them panthers. I'll find it real quick while we're talking here. But anyway, it's a whole nother look to the leopard ball thing. And
I noticed on your pied picture there, those had some pretty funky patterns going on, not just the usual striping that you see.
Yeah. There's something in there, and I've talked to Pete Call about it, and he was saying how the whole leopard thing, and also Greg Graziani, because he's one of the first guys to figure it out and put his finger on it, and he's like a dog with a bone. When he gets something like that, he's got to breed it and see what he gets out of it. So there's something going on with the pied gene, in that somewhere down the line, when either probably Pete Call bred a pied to a normal somewhere, the normal must have had something going on with it, and those traits just were carried on into a few het pieds. Lucky people had het pieds from him. So it's not like that trait is in every het pied out there. It's obvious that it's not. So that's another really cool project. I mean, again, it's kind of ridiculous with what's going on with all this stuff.
So you created the Amethyst Super Cinny.
Yeah, that's a super cinnamon that's het leucistic. So it looks like, I call it the Amethyst because when it first hatched, it looked like it was purple. And now it's still a similar color, but it's more of a, like a, it's hard to explain, more like a purplish, grayish color, I guess.
Well, going back to that champagne Het Russo, that thing is stunning. So how does that age?
That ages even better as it goes. It looks really, really cool. I mean, as it's grown, it's getting lighter and lighter and lighter.
Are you finding that true?
It's almost like a ghost. What do they call them? Mimosa. A mimosa ball. It's very similar. I'm going to have to switch phones. Hold on a second.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, one of my phones is losing battery. Okay.
So are you finding that that's what it does? It really brightens up things and cleans it up?
Completely brightens them up, exactly. I mean, everything you make with my Het Russo is totally brighter, yellower, just really soups it up. It's amazing what it does to it.
Now, would you say a pewter Russo that got a yellow tint to it?
I haven't made one yet, but that thing would be really cool too, because the yellow is going to be, again, completely souped up and really yellow. So.
All right. Well, let's switch up again. And
it's just an underrated snake. A lot of people don't realize the potential until they start seeing what I've done with it. So, and I'm not the type of guy who goes around with a flag saying, "Look what I made! Look what I made!" So maybe that's my own.
I have to admit, when we did see you at the show for the first time, and I was looking at this animal, and you're like, "Yeah, it creates an all-white snake," and I'm like, "That thing does?" I couldn't believe it, but seeing is believing, and then mixing it with other things, it's just going to, just a little bit of time. I'm sure people will be catching on to that more and more. I'm sure you're seeing it selling more and more.
Right.
All right, so let's get into the Chondros. Is that how you say it?
Congos?
No, the Chondro, the green tree pythons.
Oh, Chondros.
Chondros, okay.
Yeah.
Let's get into those guys. Do they deserve the bad rep that, people tend to give them? Like, what's your experience with them?
Yeah, they do deserve the bad rep. No, I've done well with them over the years, but I've noticed that they do not do well with neglect. I mean, I sell a bunch of them every year, and only the real diehard hobbyists who are in it for the long run keep them alive and well for the longevity of time. Most people who buy chondros and they're not really savvy on keeping snakes, or maybe they're just used to maintaining a few ball pythons or colubrids, they just can't handle the upkeep on a chondro. I mean, a green tree python requires, amazingly enough, their care requirements are low, but their discipline requirements are high in that they need the humidity to shed properly. They need the proper heat. A lot of people keep them way too hot, and a lot of people keep them way too cold. So it's like finding that happy medium, that 82 to 86 degree temperature for them is difficult for people, because with a boa or a ball python, you turn on a heat tape to 92 degrees or 95 degrees, and they're fine. But if you put a chondro under a heat lamp at 95 degrees, you'll cook it and dry it out and kill it. So I find them extraordinarily easy to keep because I keep them in my snake building in just at ambient room temperature of the building with a small heat lamp that's very low wattage that only is on for a few hours a day. And I keep them humid when they need it and keep them a little drier when they need it and feed them very sparingly. I mean, my chondros eat maybe once every 3 weeks, maybe once every 4 weeks, and that's it. So to me, they're like keeping corn snakes in a tree. They don't need a lot of heat, and I don't feed them a lot. So, but to some people, they either kill them with kindness or they kill them with neglect. It's really hard to find that happy medium with chondro or green tree pythons.
And that Myan gold is definitely a stunning animal.
Yeah, that animal came from Eugene Bissette's efforts. He produced that snake in '92. I got it from him in 2002. And oddly enough, in his care, it never laid fertile eggs. When I got it, it laid fertile eggs for me a few times, but I used a completely unrelated male breeding to that snake. So, and I've got progeny from her that look a lot better than her. So I've kept that line going, and Eugene's a good friend of mine. I mentioned him a few times now, and he doesn't have any chondros at all anymore. I think he's got a few males left, and that's it. But I've carried on his legacy simply because he's my friend, and I love chondro pythons, and hopefully I'll keep that bloodline going forever because it's a really unique line of snakes. Their pedigree and heritage goes back to the 1970s when he had gotten some snakes in from Indonesia through one of his mentors, one of Eugene's mentors, and so to me they are the epitome of the representative of the chondro python that's been created in captivity. And I also keep the locality-specific ones. I've got Wamena and Lyra and some sarong animals and arus. But I really, really like the OS animals, the really yellow ones. And they're giant snakes compared to my Wamenas. I mean, those OS high yellow snakes could eat a Wamena and wouldn't have a lump in them. That's how big they are. Meaning an adult OS high yellow could eat an adult Wamena snake and wouldn't leave a lump in them.
Well, you mixed that Myan gold with the Aztec sun, and that was definitely a great combination. The outcome was outstanding.
Yeah, and I've kept a bunch of animals from that breeding, and they're breeding now. So we'll see what we get the second generation out. See what happens.
Do you let all your females maternally incubate? Because I saw a couple pictures there with babies sitting down beneath them. That was a pretty cool picture.
Yeah, I do. If they'll do it, I leave them. Yeah, Oddly enough, all of those Waminas and Liras and those mountain chondros maternally incubate very well. All of them do. Oddly enough, the OS snakes, which are multiple generations in captivity, do not maternally incubate very well. They will do it. Some of them will do it, but some of them, they'll stay on the eggs for a week or two and then they get off of them. So, or some of them just get on the eggs for a week and then get off them right away. So then I've got to put them in an incubator. But if they'll maternally incubate, I leave them. I've even done it with ball pythons, where the incubator was full and I had nowhere to put the clutches. I just leave the females on the eggs, and they all hatch. I mean, last year we had a hurricane come through. I didn't have power for 2 weeks. I had a generator running the overhead heaters, the oil-fired heaters that heat the whole building, and I had another generator on my incubator, but I had about 6 or 7 female ball pythons on their own eggs. They had no supplemental heat for 2 weeks. The building got down into the low 70s, and I just assumed those clutches weren't going to hatch. They were done, but a week or two after the storm was done and the heat came back on, all those clutches hatched, and every single egg hatched in those clutches. So those females coiled up on their eggs. Now, these are ball pythons, obviously. They coiled up on their eggs and kept them warm when the ambient temperature was in the low 70s for 2 weeks, and the eggs hatched. So I don't know how they did it, but they did it.
Because supposedly they don't vibrate to generate heat. Is that, I forgot what it's called. They'll
constrict and twitch their muscles to create heat, but I didn't see too much of that. I did put a temperature probe on a couple of the clutches, and they were definitely much warmer than the air temperature, that's for sure. So they must have conserved enough heat just to keep those eggs alive. They took longer to hatch, obviously, because they were cooler, but they all hatched, amazingly enough. So I'm a believer in maternal incubation on anything. If they'll do it, let them.
Well, you think underground, what are those temps going to be over in Africa? You know, they're not going to be 90 degrees.
Well, I know a study was done by a guy named Greer, and it was in one of those reptile magazines back in the 90s, I think it was. I might even have it in my office here. I think it's Reptile and Amphibian magazine. A guy named Greer did an article on temperatures in maternally nesting female ball pythons, and he found temperatures close to 100 degrees in some of these nests. So,
wow.
I mean, would I expose my ball python eggs to 100 degrees? No, I wouldn't. But who knows? Maybe getting cooler at night and then maybe 100 degrees for a few hours in the day doesn't kill them. I don't know. I really don't.
So while we're on the ball pythons, do you feed them in the same frequencies as these other animals, you know, like try to mimic the wild and not overfeed them?
Yeah, I do, because if you notice, you know, you're keeping ball pythons yourself, you notice there's a certain time of year when they're really feeding well. They come out looking for a rat. And that's when you got to feed them. That's when you feed them as much as they'll eat. I have a few friends of mine who got into ball pythons just because they want to make money from them, and they were boa guys, and they'll say to me, "Oh, they don't eat good." I'm like, "Yeah, because they don't eat in the middle of the winter, you know, especially males. They barely eat." You know, once you realize what their seasonality is in your building, in your environment, then you feed them when they're hungry. And for me, that's the late summer and the fall for the ball pythons. That's when they're really eating a lot.
All right, well, another species you keep over there is the hognose, man. Those things are so cute. I definitely want to try to add one of those to the collection here in the future. I mean, been thinking about them for a couple of years, but, you know, haven't never pulled the trigger because it's always them or a ball python, you know. It's always the ball python is the choice. But why don't you give us a little rundown on those guys, how you set those guys up?
The hogs are, they're no different than most colubrids that people keep, like corns and kings and stuff. The biggest difference that I'd see with them is feeding habits. They definitely will gorge themselves in the spring, like I was saying before. They're opportunistic feeders, so where they come from in nature, they hibernate, and then when the winter is over, they come out and start looking for food. And in the spring, toads are looking for vernal ponds to spawn, or I should say lay eggs. And those hognose snakes are sitting around the edge of those vernal ponds looking to eat as many toads as they can, and they'll just gorge themselves and eat and eat and eat. And they stay really hot. You got to keep them warm when you're doing that. And they do breed pretty easily. What I did notice with hognose snakes is their breeding lifespan, I should say, is very short. Not like a corn snake or a king snake. Like a corn or a king can breed and lay viable eggs for 10 years, 10 to 12 years, no problem. Then after that, they start petering out. But a hognose snake, if you get 3 to 4 breeding seasons out of one, you're in good shape. So I'm constantly rotating out new females on the hogs. They really don't. It might be that they have a finite number of eggs, meaning they have a certain number of eggs that they can produce in their lifetime and they're done. I really don't know. I don't think enough research has been done yet, at least not on my part. Just from my own observations, I've noticed that once they get past 5 or 6 breeding years, then that's probably a 6 or 7 year old snake. They're basically done. They just peter out, and they don't really lay too many fertile eggs after that. My best breeders are the young 3-year-olds that I raised from hatchlings in my facility. So they're just a really neat snake. They don't get really big. They're very small if you think about it. They come in all sorts of colors now. I mean, we started making the Aztec ones a bunch of years ago, and now we started making snows from them. And just, there's a book out now. John Berry has one on hognose snakes, and he goes into detail about all the morphs that are available, and it's second to corn snakes with all the morphs that are popping up in hognose now. So they're great snakes. They're a great investment. They are prolific when they're young breeders that are eating well. So I would recommend them for anybody who wants to get into hogs.
And they don't tend to play dead once you handle them a bunch. Is that true?
Yeah, I've never had a captive one play dead, other than a real small baby that if you startle them or drop them, they play dead. But other than that, no, they really don't. And most of the ones that freaks me out. Yeah, most of the ones we're using are Western hogs. So, I mean, they're multiple generations in captivity. They really don't do that. They will, but it's not common.
They're evolving.
Right.
So what shows do you been besides White Plains we see you at?
I'm not a showmonger. I'm not into that whole, peddling my reptiles at a flea market mentality. My animals speak for themselves and sell themselves. So the reason why I do White Plains is because it's, it's only a couple hours from my house, and it's an easy ride in the morning. And I've known Bruce for many years, and I go there because I'm starting to have some regular customers that come looking for me, and it's just a nice venue, and it's a good place to see other people that are in the industry. I also do the Daytona show down in Daytona, the National Reptile Breeders Expo with Wayne Hill. I've been doing that show since 1991, I think was the first one he had, which was at a Holiday Inn or something like that. It was in Orlando. So those are the only shows I do. That's it. I also go to Houghton in Holland for Snake Day, which is in October. and I do that show once a year. And again, I go there I just do that one show a year in Europe because I simply don't have the time nor the energy to take all that time out and travel that far, pack up animals and travel once a month. I just can't do it. It's not fair to the animals, number one. Number two, it's not fair to me and my family. So, once a year I go to Europe, and once a year I go to Daytona, and once every 2 or 3 months I go to White Plains, and I think that's enough for me.
Awesome, man. Well, we like seeing you out there, man. You're a cool dude.
Thanks.
So is there anything you'd like to add in this before we end this transmission?
Not really. Thanks for having me on the show. Hopefully some people got some good information. And I hope people that are when they're looking to get into snakes, to contact a reputable breeder such as myself to get into the animals and learn about them, and try to stay away from. And I'm not knocking other people. Try to stay away from that flea market mentality dealer at a show, because there's a lot of guys at shows that don't necessarily breed snakes. They're just jobbing them out and selling them here and there. So if you're looking for a high-end animal or something that you think you want to eventually breed, I've mentioned many reputable breeders in this short time that we've been on the phone with each other. Contact somebody you think that is in it because they're passionate about what they do and not passionate about the money they make from it, and get some good, healthy animals and good, healthy stock to start your breeding projects and go from there. So, other than that, good luck.
Well, you heard it here. Support your local breeder. Well, actually, there is one thing I'd like to get your take on. I didn't put it in my notes. You're a New Yorker, so I'm sure you're aware of this dangerous animal ban that's just come about. I'd like to get your take on that, and it seems, every way we turn, it's something new. So I'd like to get your take and, let other people hear your view on this BS, basically.
Yeah, it's going to be a never-ending battle that we're going to be up against. I think as a community of reptile keepers, we need to stick together and just educate the masses, because obviously a law like that's trying to be passed by a senator is almost out of ignorance. Using words like wild animals. Again, trying to explain to people that what we do are multiple generations in captivity. I like to ask a politician one day, if I had them in front of me, to define wild animal. I mean, are my Chondro pythons wild animals since they've been in captivity since 1976, their bloodlines? I mean, to me, that's not a wild animal. That's a captive-produced animal that's been domesticated. So I think what we need to do to go forward is everybody needs to educate people in their own communities, in their own backyards, about reptiles and about what we do. I've spoken about this many times with a lot of people at different levels, and a lot of other breeders too. And I'm also on the board of a few organizations that are working on these things. And I'm also the president of the Long Island Herpetological Society. We're constantly working on things like this. And what we're doing is we're educating the people in our own demographic to understand about reptiles and about what the benefits they have as far as pet ownership and responsible ownership. Showing people that, being a responsible pet owner is one thing. And it's no different whether you have a pet reptile or a pet dog or cat. If we're worried about harmful animals harming the general public, I'd be a lot more worried about somebody who had some really big dogs that weren't socialized very well. I'd be a lot more worried about that. And I'm not even going to mention breeds, just any dogs that aren't socialized properly, that are trying to bite a kid or something like that. And cats, people leaving cats outside all day to eat our indigenous wildlife, to me, that's just it's just horrible. all of these laws that get passed in the guise of helping the environment, especially that whole Burmese python thing down in Florida, they jumped on the bandwagon and say, oh, the Burmese pythons are eating indigenous wildlife in Florida, which they are. But what about all the indigenous birds that are being eaten every day by the 60 million feral cats in the United States? So, I mean, we need to educate the public in that, yeah, cats are cute and fuzzy and nice pets, but they can do some damage too. It's not only the Burmese python and the Everglades that's doing damage to the environment. Again, I can't reiterate enough, educating the masses on responsible pet ownership is our number one thing that we're going to be up against, and it's going to be a never-ending battle. And until we get to that point where people understand that ball pythons are domesticated animals, it's going to be difficult. So, but if we all stick together and act like human beings and go through the proper channels when things like these do occur, then I think we'll make it. Until then, we can't act like oh, poor us, we're targeted. We can't. We need to stand up for our rights and act as one, and say this is what we're going to do. We're going to educate as many people as we can about what we do, and that's it. So, I mean, people think that since we keep reptiles that they're these ferocious creatures that are trying to find you and kill you, and it's not the case. There's millions of responsible reptile pet owners in the United States, and I think these politicians who are trying to pass these bills and laws are just not aware of that. They're not aware of the size of the reptile industry, the billions and billions of dollars a year industry that is created in the pet industry. So that's about all.
We will be heard.
Yeah, just when a lot of the stuff went down in New York State 10 years ago, I ended up going to Albany and talking to a senator myself. So if everybody takes the time out or tries to take the time out to contact somebody, whether it be their local senator or their state senator or even their congressman, go visit your congressman and talk to him and say, this is what I do. This is how it's helping out my kids in school, learning about science. This is how we're helping out the kids in the classroom with a demonstration or a presentation on proper reptile care. That's what we have to do. Everybody has to do it. They can't sit and complain. They have to. You see plenty of videos online of people saying, I went to my kid's class today and I showed them the bearded dragon, and everybody went nuts. They thought it was the greatest thing. More of that has to be done. More education. That's what has to be done.
Well, that's an excellent answer, Vin. And again, we definitely appreciate you coming on Herp Hooray.
Anytime, my friend.
Awesome. Well, we'll hold you to that. Be sure to check out Vin's website, cuttingedgeherp.com. All right, guys, don't forget to go over to herphooray.com and check out that contest that we're holding for the H3 female pastel ball python giveaway. You don't want to miss out. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Herp Hooray. Herp Hooray out.
This is Ken Masick from Ken Masick Reptiles, listening to Herp Hooray.